excited to be walking you guys through workflow today. While we give everyone just a couple minutes to join, we'll have a poll on your screen with just a fun question that you can answer. And then Deepa and I are going to go ahead and briefly introduce ourselves. So, I am Bethany, and I have a background in education and customer support. When I'm not working, you'll find me doing embroidery, building a Lego set with my son, or playing board games. And if anyone else out there likes board games, two of my favorite are Catan and Splendor.
And hi, everyone. It's so nice to have you here. I'm Deepa, and I originally come from a computer science and technical background, but I've always been passionate about combining my technical knowledge with my interest in customer focused and functional areas. And when I'm not working, you can most likely find me at the gym, playing soccer, or spending time with my mini golden doodle, Archie.
Archie's very cute, by the way, if anyone's wondering. Okay, so Deepa and I are both product marketing specialists here at Cognito Forms, and our role really revolves around directly interacting with our customers to learn more about their experience and kind of those different ways that people use our product. We take a lot of this knowledge back to our product managers and internal teams to find ways to improve the experience. Um, Through this, we've also built a lot of workflow driven templates for different industries. And the goal of that is to just help our new customers get started easily and quickly, and to showcase workflow in a very relevant way to them. Um, so, through all this, we've created some simple, some complex, but a lot of different workflow templates. And Deepa and I really understand all of those ins and outs of workflow, of building workflows that you would experience in Cognito Forms. So we are excited to go through some of those basics to help you better understand how to build a well-rounded workflow. All right, so today we're going to start with just kind of an overview of workflow and some of the benefits that you might experience when using workflow. And then we'll go through all the bits and pieces, just kind of explaining all the parts that make up workflow. And then after that, you'll watch a step-by-step walkthrough, a demo of exactly how to build a workflow from scratch. And then lastly, we'll go through some best practices that we recommend when building, but then also how to manage and test it afterwards. Um, I do want to note that we are not going to cover workflow tasks or person fields in depth today. We'll touch on them briefly, but if you want to learn more about those, they're two of our newer features. If you want to learn a little bit more about those, we will cover them more in depth in part 2 of this webinar series. And that one's called Building Advanced Workflows, which we'll have a link on your screen here in a moment that you can sign up for that if you haven't done so already. And then just one last thing before we jump in. The chat is currently private, but as you think of questions as we walk through some of the material, feel free to send them in. We don't plan to answer questions as they come in, but we do have a moderator here today to help mark some of those as a good question for our Q&A portion at the end. So if your question does not get covered in the Q&A, please feel free to send that question into our customer success team, and they will be happy to answer it there. And if anyone is new here to Cognito Forms, we're excited you're here, and we are a no-code form builder with powerful workflow capabilities to help automate your business and work more efficiently. Our main goal this past year has been to focus on task-driven workflows and really engaging your team directly in your workflows. So while the base of our platform is built on just custom-built forms, you see a lot more value and benefits when utilizing workflow features. Okay, let's go ahead and get into what workflow is. So in general, a workflow is just referring to the sequence of steps involved when moving from the beginning to the end of a working process. So it's just that process that your work takes. And then in Incognito Forms, a workflow involves statuses, actions, roles, and emails that all work. They're all kind of intertwined and they work together to help you complete the overall task or goal. And just a little bit of context on why we added workflow capabilities to our form builder. Basically, we really believe in empowering anyone, regardless of technical background, to be able to meaningfully engage in collaboration and achieve those business goals. So we want to enable you and your team to be able to work efficiently and be successful in the work that you do. And then just some of the benefits you'll see when using workflow. First, you'll see increased operational efficiency. So, because you have built that standardized workflow right in your form, the process is going to be consistent. It'll go through all of those same steps every single time. And in hand, this is going to reduce room for delays or missed steps in the workflow and really just ensure that the workflow proceeds as you intended it and as you built it. And then you're also going to likely see the delegation of tasks sort of simplifying. So, with the logic that you've built into the form, you can automatically assign an entry to a staff member, meaning that you no longer have to take time out of your day to delegate those tasks yourself. And this also just helps your team know exactly how to access the form and then complete their work. And then you'll likely see reduced manual labor and increased automation. So because you've configured your workflow to notify individuals of updates as soon as they happen, you're going to reduce that busy work that you have for you and your employees, meaning that you guys can focus more on the work that is meaningful and impactful to your organization. And then last but not least, just better alignment within your team. So when you configure roles and tasks within your workflow, everyone can kind of come into that one centralized location to get their work done. And everyone knows exactly what they need to do and remains on the same page together. Okay, we could not talk about workflow without mentioning conditional logic simply because custom workflows just wouldn't be possible without conditional logic. And this is going to be just that act of setting conditions or rules that affect the outcome of a process. So, different actions in your workflow can occur based on whether certain conditions are met. This essentially allows you to send people on a unique path through your forms. And some examples of this include the one on your screen, which is just kind of showing or hiding certain fields from people based on something they select in the form. You can also send unique emails depending on a response. So you might want to send one email if an inquiry is something, and a different email if it's a different type of inquiry. You might want to send a different one if it's approved versus if it's denied. So some of those conditions can then trigger a different email to be sent. And then you can also allow action buttons to be available to certain roles. So you would not want your customers to be able to see an approved button or a denied button, but you would want your internal team to be able to see those. So with conditional logic, you can kind of filter those buttons that people see. So in short, there's just a lot of different ways that conditional logic plays an important role in workflow, and you're going to see a lot of this as we go throughout today's session. And now I'm just going to go ahead and hand it over to Deepa.
And now, thank you, Bethany. Now that we've discussed what workflow is, let's dive deeper into the different parts that it's comprised of. So, to start, we'll be discussing actions. Workflow actions are buttons on your form that allow users to perform tasks, such as submitting an application or approving a PTO request, for example. Actions play a crucial role in advancing your workflow to the next step. They can trigger tasks such as displaying confirmation messages, sending emails, and so much more that we're going to dive deeper into in the next couple of slides. And in essence, actions are the driving force behind your workflow. Without them, you wouldn't be able to progress to the next step and move your workflow forward. The next component we'll be discussing are statuses. Workflow statuses are the steps within your workflow. So they essentially help you keep track of the progress of each entry, as entries can be at different stages at any given time. The colored indicators that you see on the screen here next to each entry under the status column signify their current stage within the workflow. So new, closed, estimate, approved, those are all different statuses that might have been set up in the workflow. And just as a quick note, we're using the term entry, and when we mention that, we're essentially referring to an individual submission. In this image, for example, each submission is considered a separate entry. So numbers 20, 17, 14, those are all distinct submissions. The next component we're discussing are roles. Roles represent the different functions that individuals in your workflow can perform. Each distinct function within your workflow should have its own role. So for example, in an expense report workflow, something we're going to be walking through later in today's webinar, you might have 10 different managers at your company. If they all perform the same task, you would only need one manager role because they are of the manager status. No matter who the manager is, they can go in and perform those same actions. However, if you have two or more managers who are responsible for different tasks, then you would want them to have separate roles. So it's best not to attach the concept of a role to one specific person because different people can generally perform the same role, as highlighted by this example. We essentially recommend thinking of a role more as a purpose that a person can have when involved in this process. A workflow in Cognito Forms will typically include one public role and one internal role by default. Any additional roles added would be of the other type. And keep in mind, for those of you feeling extra ambitious, you can only create a maximum of 20 roles per form. And again, tying this back all to the concept of conditional logic that Bethany first introduced, you can hide or make certain fields visible based on the role, since different roles can have different tasks to complete. Now that we've discussed roles, actions, and statuses all separately from one another, let's discuss how their connection makes up workflow. So actions often have a status associated with them. For example, clicking submit automatically changes an entry's status from incomplete to pending initial review, as you see on the screen here. And this is something you set up when creating an action in the workflow settings on our form. So you would go in, you would create your actions, you would create your statuses, and you can sort of decide which action should have which status associated with it. So for the example on the screen, we have our submit action, and we want to change the status to pending initial review. This connection between actions and statuses is essentially what drives the workflow forward. When creating new actions, you'll want to specify the status that the entry should move to next. And because you're specifying that status, the workflow is able to move from one status to the next with the press of an action button. So again, in this example, when submit is clicked, the status automatically is being changed to pending initial review. You can also choose to restrict certain actions to only show during specific statuses. And again, take a guess, this is using the conditional logic capabilities we earlier discussed. So how do roles, actions, and statuses all connect together? Well, the connection between roles, statuses, and actions is essentially what enables users to create custom workflows with unique form experiences for everyone involved. While this might seem a bit overwhelming to start, don't worry, we're here to walk you through all of it step by step. So, actions and statuses can control what information a specific role can access on their form. So What does that mean? Well, for instance, if an entry status is marked as incomplete, one role might be allowed to input those details and submit the form, while another role might be restricted from seeing those fields or entering information at all. So, for example, if I am an employee and I'm completing an expense report form, I might be allowed to go in and I might see those empty fields to input my expense. And so I can input it and I can press submit. Whereas if I were a manager viewing that, I might not be able to see those fields at all simply because my role is to approve that expense. So I would see buttons like approve or deny rather than submit, if that makes sense. And similarly, you can control which action buttons are available to which roles, as I just mentioned. For example, I might be able to only see the approve and deny buttons as a manager. And while someone in the employee role wouldn't see those at all, since they're specifically only set to show for the manager role, instead, the employee would see submit or their own set of action buttons. Moving along, we have email notifications, which is also a huge part of automating your processes using workflow. Custom email notifications are directly tied to your action buttons on the form, such as submit, approve, or deny. These notifications are configured within the settings for each action. So when an action button is clicked, the corresponding email is automatically triggered and sent out. Email notifications can serve a variety of different purposes and are very useful. They can confirm entry submissions so someone knows when an entry has been submitted. They can alert someone about a change in a form status, so you'll know the status has changed from incomplete to pending initial review. And they can also serve to invite others to access the form and complete assigned tasks. So the manager now knows to go in and complete their assigned task of approving or denying an expense report. You can fully customize your email content to include whatever you want it to include. So we have options to include entry information. So the employee can potentially see what their expenses were, and they'll have that all in the email. You can also include payment summaries if that's an option on the form you've set up. And you can also include uploaded files and documents for people to see. So your recipients have everything they need in one place, and it's very easy for you to set up and make it happen automatically. In short, email notifications are a key part of streamlining your workflow. They keep everyone informed of updates and tasks, and they eliminate the need for manual updates. So after a form is submitted, I don't have to somehow go and inform my manager that I've submitted the form. They're automatically informed because we had that set up in the workflow. So it just helps tasks occur more easily and more efficiently overall. The next thing we want to discuss is workflow link sharing. Workflow links are the driving force behind sharing role-based entry data with individuals and roles. By using workflow links, you can provide users with customized links to your entries. So that enables them to make changes, take actions, or simply review their information. These unique workflow links ensure that each role sees only the information relevant to them. So going back to the expense report example, an employee submitting an expense report form would only see that the empty fields that they need to populate for their expense, while the manager would see a read-only version of that completed form along with options to either approve or deny the expense. Each view is tailored specifically to the role, ensuring a seamless and very user-specific experience. So when someone is sent a workflow link, like the manager, for example, they can access the platform and perform actions based on their role that the link was intended for. So, for example, a manager might receive an email containing a workflow link specifically designated for the manager role. And this is something you can set up in the email notifications that we discussed earlier. You can specify who that workflow link is supposed to be sent for, what role, etc. And that would be based on who you want to come in and perform different tasks. So by automating these email notifications throughout your workflow and using workflow link sharing, you can essentially send the right workflow link to the right person with the right data at the right time. The next thing we want to discuss are assigned entry views. Assigned entry views essentially let you create unique views of your entries for different roles. In this example shown on the screen, the coordinator, as you can see, can access both the all entries views and as well as the self-nominations view, while the judge can only access and see the entries in the for review view. You can easily create and customize these views when looking at a form's entries. This includes filtering entries for each view or only selecting specific columns of data to display, depending on what you want the users to see. So in this example, assuming this is an award nomination form template, we want to ensure that the judge doesn't have access to the candidate's name, for example, to ensure that the process remains as unbiased as possible. So we can go in when creating this for review view using the advanced filter, we can go in and remove the column with the name details. So he would no longer have access to that and they can continue on judging as they need without any sort of bias. So we have a couple new features that we want to touch on here that we released last year. So we have workflow tasks as well as person fields, and we're going to dive deeper into this in part 2 of our webinar series. So we hope to see you all there, where you'll learn more about these new features and sort of just building more advanced workflows. But to touch on it in today's webinar, workflow tasks is a feature that enables you to create personalized to-do lists for your team members. And it essentially gives you the ability to share user-specific task views with your workflow participants. So when you share these task views with your team members, they can log into Cognito Forms to view their assigned tasks all in one spot without having to guess what they have to do or which forms to go to. So this helps them ensure that they don't miss a thing. So as you'll see here, when using workflow tasks, there will be an orange notification badge that pops up with the number of tasks that you have. You can click on that and see which forms need your attention, which forms and which entries. And the next feature we want to touch on is person fields. Person fields allow you to select from a list of people, like employees or clients, for example, and that list is based on entries from another form, where each entry represents a person. If you're familiar with some of our form fields, person fields function very similarly to lookup fields. It's essentially a lookup field for people. So this form you create can gather details about the person's role, for example, whether they're active or not. They can also gather a headshot to upload, and that's something you can show on this list. As you can see here on the screen, we currently only have the initials popping up, but if there was a headshot that we added for Drew or Antonio, that would be popping up on the screen next to their name. And that's all we'll be touching on for now, but if you're interested and curious to learn more about these features, we highly suggest you join us for part 2 of our webinar series. And now I'm going to hand it off to Bethany to discuss more about our workflow and demo.
Alrighty, now let's jump into actually watching a workflow being built step by step, real time in Cognito Forms. The example we're going to look at today is for an expense report. We chose this one because hopefully you guys have at least a little bit of experience in some capacity, but if not, you'll kind of be able to see at least how everything works in the platform. The general process is going to start with the employee submitting the form and then an email being sent to the manager to let them know that it needs their attention. The manager can then access the entry and approve or deny that expense. If it's denied, an email will go to the employee just letting them know. And then if it's approved, an email will go to the accounting team to let them know that they need to act further on that expense report. And then accounting can then come in and mark which budget the expense is being paid from. Using the pay action, they can then mark it as complete. So then from your view of entries, staff that access it will be able to kind of see the status is completed on that specific entry, letting them know that they don't need to act on it again or act on it further. Okay, let's go ahead and watch our demo now.
When you first open the form in the build page, you'll be taken to the form settings section. We've already added a few of the basic fields for the sake of time, but you would need to start by adding those fields yourself. You'll notice that when we go to the workflow settings section, you can see there are only two statuses, two actions, and two roles. This is the default view for any new forms created, so we'll need to modify and add to this in order to create a custom workflow. The first thing I want to set up are the roles of the people or functions involved in the workflow. For our expense report scenario, I will need a role for an employee, manager, and accounting. The public role is the person completing the form or initiating the workflow. In this case, it would be the employee, so I'm going to change the name of it to employee. The internal role can be renamed to manager, and any additional roles you add here are considered of the type other. Here, we'll be adding an other role for accounting. Now that we have our roles set up, let's think about the actions and statuses that we need throughout the process. Creating a basic diagram of the workflow prior to building it out can be helpful. As you can see, the diagram we made will now help us decide on the actions and statuses we need for the rest of our workflow. We already have a submit action and status, so we need to think about what happens after this. According to the diagram we made, the next person involved in the workflow would be the manager. They would need to take action to approve or deny the expense report that was submitted. So let's go ahead and make an approved status and an approve action button, along with a denied status and a deny action button. If the manager approves the expense, then only will accounting be involved. Once they decide the budget category and pay the expense out, the workflow will be complete. So let's go ahead and name this last status completed. In order for them to initiate that it's been paid, they'll need a pay action button. And just as a quick note, your status names do not have to be the past tense of your action names. You can name it anything you want. You also might notice the update button is not connected to any statuses. This is because it is essentially meant to save changes made to the form without impacting the status of the workflow. Before we continue, I need to make sure only the accounting team has access to this internal updates section. I'm going to make this section only visible to the accounting role while in the approved or completed status. Then I want the accounting role to not be able to make changes to the entry after it's been paid out. So I'll add a read only condition as well. This will be when the role is accounting and in completed status. All right, now that we have the form and the workflow steps ready to go, we need to go in and make sure we have the correct conditional logic on the actions and the correct email notifications set up to help move the process along appropriately. First, let's look at the submit button. We want to make sure that only the employee role has access to this button and only when it's in the incomplete status. For role indicates that this role will always have access to this button no matter what the status or other conditions may be. Since we want to limit the action by both role and status, we're going to use the when option. We'll select entry.status is incomplete and then entry.role is employee. So after it is submitted, this button will no longer be available on this particular entry. Let's also quickly double check that the correct status is connected to this action button. And then we need to think about the emails going out when this action button is clicked. We'd first need the manager to receive an email notifying them that an expense is ready to be reviewed. We'll make sure the email is going to the correct email address. And in this case, we're just going to use ours for all of them. And it has their roles shared workflow link so they can access the entry and make the updates needed for their role. In addition to notifying the manager, we want the employee to receive a confirmation email. For the confirmation email, we can pull in the email field to automatically be sent to the employee's email address. But something we'd like to do is not even need the employee to enter their email every time they submit an expense report. As you can see in the preview mode here, employees currently need to type in their name and email address every time they fill out the form. We're going to replace these fields with a person field. This field is an easier way to automatically capture your logged in users' information and connect them to steps in your workflow. If you want to learn more about how to set up person fields, our next webinar, Building Advanced Workflows, is going to dive deeper into this topic, but you can also visit our user guides to learn more as well. Now let's check our approve action. We'll first make sure this action is only available to the manager role while in the submitted status. Next, we'll double check that this action is moving the entry into the correct status. Once we have that set up, we'll need to create an email going to the accounting team to notify them that an expense needs to be paid. We'll add their email address, change the content in the email, and add their roles workflow link. Remember, this workflow link is different from the other roles, so they'll see the content they need to see, while other roles will see something different. Next, let's set up the deny action. This action should only be available to the manager and in the submitted status, just like the approve button. Both action buttons would show up for the manager at the same time. Now, moving on to the emails for this action, remember this one is not sending an email to accounting like the approve action did. Instead, we'll have an email sent to the employee letting them know their expense was denied. We don't need to add any workflow links to this email since the employee won't be able to change anything. Lastly, let's look at the pay action. This action should only be available to the accounting role while in the approved status. Then we'll want an email to go to the employee notifying them that their expense was paid. We'll pull in their email address and change the content of the email. Again, no workflow link is needed here. Another thing to note is that we'll want to ensure the fields that were inputted by the employee are made read-only for the other roles. This is so that the manager or accounting team does not accidentally change any of those fields. Because we have all the employee fields in a section, we can simply make this entire section read-only for the manager and accounting roles. Now that we have the form and the workflow completely set up, let's look at what we can do in the entries page with assigned entry views to further customize our workflow and how we get work done. You'll notice the All Entries entry view is automatically created and assigned to whatever that internal role was. In this case, we renamed Internal to Manager so they have access to this. If we wanted to add an entry view for the accounting team to see approved expenses, we'll click New View and then I want to name it Pending Payment, since these entries would be any that are approved but not yet paid. I'm going to assign it to the accounting role, so this view is specifically for those in this role. I don't want our accounting team to be able to create new entries at this stage in the workflow, so let's go ahead and turn this setting off. You'll also notice the shared with me setting here. This makes personalized interviews and task assignments possible. We'll go into greater detail about how to use these features in the next webinar, Building Advanced Workflows. Let's quickly filter the entries in this view to only entries in the approved status and then save our changes. At this point, we would typically test the workflow using preview mode. In preview, you can toggle between roles and statuses to see what the form looks like and how it functions. For the sake of time, we're going to skip this step, but we recommend testing your form in preview as you build it or before testing with the public link. Now let's go ahead and look at the workflow happening with the public link and including those emails that we set up. Remember, I set up the emails to be sent to my email address, so I'll get the emails of all the roles. You would want to make these more specific for a real workflow being used. But for testing purposes, this works great. Now I'll go ahead and add the details for my expense and then submit the form. Let's open my inbox and see what was received. I got an email as the employee confirming the expense submission and an email as the manager notifying me of changes that need to be made. I can click this workflow button to access this specific entry and make changes, or I can log into Cognito Forms, access the entries page of this form, and make changes on the entry here. This is helpful if you have multiple entries to take action on at once. I'm going to go ahead and approve this expense and then check my inbox for an email dedicated for the accounting role. When I open the email, I see a workflow link that I can access the entry. I click on the button, and now I have a section for me to designate the budget this expense is for, and then I click the pay button. Now I got an email for the employee letting them know it's been paid, and now the workflow is complete. Remember, as you test your workflow like this, you'll likely have small adjustments that need to be made. We like to test it this way until we can go through every possible route of the workflow with no errors before sharing the live form link with anyone. And that concludes our demo.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that demo, and I hope you found it useful to see exactly how you can build this workflow in Cognito Forms. Now that we've gone through that, let's now dive into a couple of best practices that we've listed out for you all when building and testing your workflows. So, while workflow automation is incredibly powerful, as we've seen, it isn't a magic wand, unfortunately. To save time and make the process as smooth as possible, we recommend mapping out your steps before you even start building your workflow. And even if your process isn't fully planned out from the beginning, it's helpful to at least have the roles or individuals involved. Having a basic flow and a clear end goal in mind will always make things easier. So here are a few best practices we recommend following before you start building your workflow. Number one, start by listing out all the tasks in your process that need to be completed, along with the end goal you want to achieve. So this can be a list of steps that you have within your workflow. So for an expense report, it would just be having the employee open up the form, submit their expense reports, and then the manager coming in to view and review what the employee has submitted and either approving or denying the request. You can start off by just listing a series of steps to get a basic idea of what you're hoping to achieve. Number two, map out the possible routes the workflow could take. So as you begin building it, you may find yourself updating or adjusting these routes as needed. And that's completely normal. We often do the same when fine-tuning our workflows. It's never exactly how we envisioned it to be, and there's always slight changes. So you can start by creating a flow chart or a diagram of some sort, like the diagram we had, just to get a basic understanding of what the different routes are and what would happen if the manager approves the request, for example, the expense report, for example, or denies it. And number three, Pinpoint the specific moments where someone needs to take an action to keep the process moving along. So for example, in our workflow demo, this could be when an employee submits an expense report or when a manager approves it. That's when we know the employee will need a button to submit their report and the manager would need a button to approve it. And identifying these key points will help you determine where to use action buttons and what statuses to create from those action buttons, and also where emails or workflow links will be necessary. It just makes everything way more easier to have it sort of just diagrammed down and to know what actions are occurring where and who would be notified when those actions occur. So now that we've covered what to do before building your workflow, what do you do during and after? Well, the biggest thing we recommend during and after setting up your form is to test it. A bunch of testing. So to start, you can begin by double checking that the conditional logic you set up for any actions, statuses, and roles are correct. You want to take a quick look to ensure that all actions are connected to the right statuses so that your workflow is progressing as expected. And you can do this in preview mode just to quickly make sure that each action is going to corresponding status. Next, we suggest double checking that any and all workflow links are linked to the correct role and being shared throughout your workflow as needed. So managers should receive the manager workflow link and no one else's. Alongside that, ensure that all emails are being sent to the correct individuals and have the correct conditional logic in place. So if you want the email to be sent to the manager when an employee submits their expense report, having that set up and double checking that the manager's email address or that email field is being pulled in as needed. And next, walk through the workflow in preview to be sure everything works as expected. Some common things that we typically find when we're double checking in preview are that fields showing up for the public role should only be showing up for the internal role. So you don't want any approve or deny or additional notes section that would be available for the manager or accounting to show up for the employee when they first access the form. And the next thing we often need to double check is fields needing to be made read only for internal roles so that they can't make changes to information submitted by a public user. There are cases where you might want an internal role to be able to update or make changes, but in the case of our workflow demo today, we didn't want that, so we made those fields read only for internal roles, so they can't make changes once an employee submits it. And also double check that actions showing up for roles that they shouldn't be that actions aren't showing up for roles that they shouldn't be. So an action meant for a manager showing up for an employee, we want to double check that that's not happening. And number 4, last but not least, test your workflow using the public link. I know it's very easy to just assume it works and hope it works after running through it in preview, but the public link is important. And that's where we often catch a couple of different things, whether it's how an email looks, whether I'm receiving the wrong workflow link. So those are all things that are better checked when testing using the public link. So run through the workflow and fill out the form as if you were each user submitting real test entries. And as shown in the demo, you can do this by adding your own email address in the to section of the email notification. And that way you'll be able to see the emails that come in and verify each workflow link. And additionally, I know we've touched on this a bit, since we are using person fields in this form, you can go ahead and add an entry to that form using your email address. So if we were to pull in that information, it's your email address that would still receive those emails and notifications. And it allows you to double check that things are working as expected using the person field as well. And we also have a workflow pre-launch checklist available in our support documentation to help you build and test your own workflows. So everything we've mentioned here, plus a couple other tips and tricks are all listed there, and you can access it by clicking the link in the pop-up notification on your screen now. And that wraps up everything that we've had for you all today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we truly appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend with us to learn more about workflows and how to use them, and we're hoping that you'll be able to start using them yourselves. We've also created a feedback survey and would greatly appreciate it if you could take a few minutes of your time to complete it. That'll be sent out in a follow-up email sometime within the next couple of days and should only take 5 to 10 minutes of your time, and we greatly appreciate your feedback. Now, we've prepped a few frequently asked questions for you all, and then after that, we will answer any questions that came in through the chat during today's session.
So the first question that is fairly common is, how many actions, statuses, and roles can I have on a form? And the answer is 20 for each. So you can have 20 actions, 20 statuses, 20 roles, and an unlimited number of email notifications as well.
The second question we have is, after a form is submitted, can a user go in and update the customer's entry? And I know we've touched on this before, so hopefully it's familiar to you. But by default, users can go in as long as I don't change anything or set up anything different, users can go in and edit and update the fields after an entry is submitted. And as discussed earlier, you can restrict or remove the ability to edit those fields by making the form read only for any internal or other roles that would review the customer's entry. So the manager or accounting in the case of today's demo. And you can further refine these conditions by making the form read only for certain statuses.
All right. Next question we have is it possible to restrict access to entry data for confidentiality purposes? And yes, you can do this by using the filter function on your entry view to filter out any entries or even columns of data that you would not want certain roles to see. You can also filter the entries shown in the view by entry status or a specific keyword. And then we also have an advanced filter option that you can dial down to specific criteria using our conditional logic builder there.
The next question we have is, can someone who is not a user of my Cognito Forms organization still receive workflow links? And the answer is yes. Workflow links can be sent to anyone. They do not have to be added or licensed users a part of your Cognito Forms organization. And users who are a part of it and users who aren't can still receive these workflow links.
And our last question that we have prepared is it possible to manually share a workflow link? And yes, you can do this directly from the entry itself. So when you open the entry, there will be a share button at the top of the entry, and then you can specify the link type. So like the role that you want the link to be for. And then you can send them an email from there or copy the link and send it manually yourself elsewhere. All right. Now we're going to jump into some of the questions you guys have been submitting throughout the session. So let me grab one here.
One of the questions that just came up is, can the changes made in a submitted form be tracked or changed in a sort of tracked, changed manner? And the answer to that question is yes. We have an audit entry trail that tracks all the changes that are made, and you can see this by navigating to the entries, selecting the specific entry that you'd like to see what changes were made, and there's an activity option once you open up the entries. And after clicking that, you'll be able to see when a form was submitted, what status occurred when, and you're able to see the exact timestamps for those changes that occurred. So it's all being tracked and available for you to see internally.
Another one I see here, are roles set per form? Yes, they are. You'll set it on each form essentially because every workflow is going to be different. And so you'll have to set those up every time.
Another question I am seeing is, someone asked if it's possible for individuals to have access to the Cognito Forms account in order to, if someone asked if individuals must have access to their Cognito Forms account in order to respond to specific workflow tasks. And as of now, we'll cover this, of course, in greater detail, part 2, so please join us there. But yes, you do have to be logged in to have workflow tasks currently. You have to be an added member of Cognito Forms, but we're releasing some new exciting things coming soon. So be on the lookout for things that might not always keep that the same in the future.
And then I see a question, is it possible to provide a link to someone like a supervisor role to only a specific section of a form? So currently, no, but one way you can make this happen is by setting um, show when role is supervisor or so with that conditional logic, you can actually set this section to be available to just that role um, or multiple roles, but hide it from a specific role. You can do all of that in the conditional logic settings.
And to piggyback off of that, yes. Another question we have, very simple, but are you planning on having a webinar on custom PDF document generation? We definitely understand this. It does take a minute to pick up. That's a good idea for the future. So we do not have any in the works for now, but we'll add that to our list and hopefully we'll be releasing something to help you build that very soon. And I see another question here. Does each employee need to have a Cognito license? It depends on what you're trying to do. If it's just, like I said, to get the workflow link, then no, they don't have to have a Cognito license to receive a workflow link or be a part of the workflow. But if you want them to be able to go in and make changes internally or build their own form, they will need to be a part of your Cognito Forms organization to do some of those. Currently, as of now, they will need to be a part of it.
I see a question that was sent in a moment ago on, is it possible to automatically send forms to archive after a set amount of time? That is not possible in Cognito Forms. It could be possible with one of our integrations. Don't quote me on that because I'm not for sure if it is or not, but our customer support team could definitely answer for sure yes or no if that's possible with integrations.
I believe we just had a question about person fields and if that can be used for someone, or if that they have to be used for people. Can the person field be used for people with no Cognito Forms account, external folks? And the answer is yes, you can. Again, we dive much deeper into that into part 2, so you'll get to hear more about that then. But yes, person fields can be used for internal and external users. They do not have to be a part of your Cognito Forms account in order to use them there.
I also see a question, is there a way to see a change when a change was made to creation? So not an entry. So actually on the form, it sounds like. And when you look at your list of forms, there's a details button that will give you the details on that specific form. And it will list who last updated it and what time. I see one, when is part 2 for the series? So we have 2 sessions for that one. One is next week, and then I believe it's February 5th. We can put the link back up on the screen right now for the sign up for that session as well.
Yes. And I see, and we can also send it out in our follow-up email with the feedback surveys. Please feel free to sign up then. Another question I see is, do workflows have date-based capabilities? In other words, can they send an email when a certain date occurs? That is a very frequently and commonly asked request from all of you. It's currently not possible, but something I guess with emails, something that's
An action has to take place for the email to go out.
You can't automatically, yes. Sorry, I was confusing it with another thing you can do. You can't automatically send set emails to be sent a certain date, but I do believe that is something that we would like to make possible in the future. It's easier.
Yeah, that one's on our radar. Let's see. How do workflows work when used with people outside of your organization? So essentially, so if you look at your forms public link, it'll essentially send them to a page like that, just the form, but it has entry data entered into it. And then people actually in your organization are the ones actually able to come into the entries page to make changes from there. But those that are not in your organization will see just that one single entry. And that's just that workflow link, the URL, so it'll be in their browser.
And I think we might have touched on bits and pieces of this, but we were asked if conditional logic can be used to lock access to a form. So for example, this individual only wants to be able to have certain members submit an application. And if they're not members, she wants them to immediately not see any of the application and reach out to the membership team to get more details about how to become a member. And yes, that is possible using conditional logic. You can, before you display the form, you can have a question that asks, are you a member of our organization? And if yes, they can see the fields. And if they aren't, they'll be prompted to, you can put a content field or any other field to say, please reach out to membership. Or you can put in an action button that allows an automatic email to be sent to your membership team. So that is possible using conditional logic. And you can sort of pick and choose what you want users to see and what you don't want users to see.
There was a question, do you have examples of using Cognito Forms to manage membership registration? We do have some templates in our template gallery. I do know we have at least one membership registration form that you could check out there. And I actually think we have a video showing that. So you could also look like on our YouTube page and see if there's anything there as well.
And we have lots of other sorts of templates. So feel free to peruse and browse if you see anything that suits your use case. And I know we touched on this earlier, is just another refresher on this. Is there a timestamp linked to a status change? Yes, there is. In each entry, if you click on the individual entry, there's an activity option, and that shows you when a status change occurred and who made that change. So you'll have all those timestamps and details there.
And then how do you track when an action has been submitted, but the next person hasn't responded in a reasonable time? Something you could do is on your entry view, actually filter by okay, you would want like your status to be submitted, and the date sent was in the last week or so. So you could kind of add an additional filter on there based on the date that it was sent out. And then if it didn't go into the new response status or whatever your next status was, then it would stay there and you could actually see it there. All right.
We're at time. Yeah. I hope we were able to answer all of your questions that came in through the chat. If you have any other questions or specific thoughts or issues about your niche use case or specific use case, please feel free to reach out to our customer support team. One of our members was moderating as well. We'd be happy to help out with your specific use case. And we really appreciate all of you here.
Yeah, awesome. And we hope to see you guys in part 2 of the series. So thank you again. And yeah, we'll see you next week if you come to that session.
Thank you all. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.